never imagined my dad had an entire family I didn't know about. Finding out shattered my world. But it also taught me about forgiveness and finding peace amid betrayal. I understand. I will be ready. Sometimes, the most beautiful illusions are the ones we build around ourselves, around the people we love. And sometimes, those illusions shatter so completely, so violently, that you wonder if you'll ever recognize the pieces again. My world, the one I thought was so solid, so true, exploded on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't an earthquake, or a car crash, or a sudden illness. It was far more insidious, far more personal. It was the realization that the man I called my father, the pillar of my childhood, the quiet strength in our family, had been living a lie for decades. An entire, separate, fully formed life, complete with another wife, another child, another family. Just saying the words now, years later, still feels like shards of glass in my throat. I remember the exact moment the first crack appeared in my perfect facade. It wasn't a grand revelation, not a dramatic confrontation. It was a fleeting glimpse, a whisper in the wind that quickly grew into a roar that consumed everything. I remember the way the air left my lungs, the dizzying sensation that the ground beneath me had simply vanished. I felt like a character in a terrible dream, watching my own life unfold from a distance, powerless, horrified. The betrayal wasn't just a wound, it was a redefinition of every memory, every hug, every "I love you" he'd ever given me. It forced me to question everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about family. And in the agonizing process of picking up those shattered fragments, I had to learn how to forgive not just him, but myself for the blindness, for the pain, for the sheer unimaginable audacity of his secret. It's a story of how a single truth can destroy a family, and how, sometimes, even in the deepest canyons of betrayal, you can find a quiet, unexpected path toward a fragile peace. So let me tell you, from the very beginning, how I discovered my father was living a secret second life. My childhood, looking back, felt like a Norman Rockwell painting. Not in a cheesy, idealized way, but in its quiet predictability and warmth. We lived in a charming, slightly too small house in a tree-lined suburb, the kind where neighbors knew your name, and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. There was my mom, Sarah, a vibrant, nurturing woman with an infectious laugh and an endless capacity for love, always baking something delicious or tending to her overflowing garden. And then there was my dad, Robert. He was a man of few words, but his presence was immense. He wasn't overtly affectionate, but his love was a steady current, expressed through reliable actions. He was the one who taught me to ride my bike, patiently holding the back of the seat for what felt like miles. He was the one who fixed everything that broke, from leaky faucets to scraped knees. He worked as a civil engineer, and I always pictured him building bridges, connecting worlds, a fitting metaphor for the man I believed him to be. We had Sunday dinners at Grandma and Grandpa's, summer vacations at a small cottage by the lake, and Christmas mornings that felt like pure magic. I have a younger brother, David, by 3 years, and we were the typical siblings, a mix of squabbles and fierce loyalty. Our family unit felt incredibly strong, a solid fortress against the world's uncertainties. Dad was always there, or so I thought. His routine was clockwork. Leave for work early, come home by 6 p.m., dinner, help with homework, read the newspaper, watch a bit of TV, then bed. Weekends were for yard work, occasional golf with his buddies, and family time. There was never a hint, not a flicker of anything amiss. He was devoted to my mother. I remember seeing them share quiet moments on the porch swing, his hand resting on her knee, a silent understanding passing between them. They weren't a couple given to grand romantic gestures, but their love felt deep, rooted, and enduring. I grew up believing in that kind of steadfast love, the kind that weathered storms, because it was built on honesty and commitment. As I move into my teenage years and then into early adulthood, leaving for college and then starting my own career, that foundation remained my anchor. My parents' home was always the place I returned to, a haven of comfort and familiarity. Dad continued to be the quiet, steady force, offering sage advice when I asked, a reassuring presence even when he said nothing. I saw him as the epitome of integrity, a man who built things, who kept his word, who loved his family above all else. This was the world I knew, the truth I lived. And it was all a meticulously constructed lie, waiting for the right moment to unravel. The first faint whispers of discord weren't audible to me then, but looking back, I can pinpoint the shift. It began subtly, insidiously, around the time I graduated college. Dad started to seem different. The clockwork precision of his schedule began to fray around the edges. He'd be late coming home, sometimes an hour, sometimes two, with vague explanations about traffic or unexpected meetings. Mom, ever the optimist, would brush it off, muttering about how busy his engineering projects must be. But I noticed the slight tension in her jaw, the way her gaze would linger on the front door. Dad also started taking more business trips. At first, it was once every few months. Then it became almost monthly. He'd pack a small suitcase, kiss Mom goodbye with a peck on the cheek, and disappear for 2 or 3 days. When he returned, he'd seem distant, preoccupied. He'd offer sparse details about his trips, always technical, always logical, never painting a picture of where he'd been or what he'd truly done. The usual warmth of his return was replaced by a quiet fatigue. Money, too, became a source of subtle friction. My parents had always been comfortable, never extravagant, but never wanting. Now, I'd overhear hushed conversations about tightening the belt or unexpected expenses. Dad, who had always been meticulously organized with finances, started to seem evasive when Mom asked about certain bills or accounts. My brother David, more intuitive than me, also started to notice things. He'd make offhand comments about Dad's new phone, a sleek smartphone that Dad insisted was for work, but which he guarded with an almost religious zeal. He never left it unattended, always carried it in his pocket, and would disappear into the garage for phone calls that felt hushed, clandestine. One evening, I was home for a visit, and Dad had gone out, again for an emergency work meeting. It was late, past 10 p.m. His old work phone, the one he rarely used anymore, buzzed on the kitchen counter. It wasn't his new one, guarded one. Out of curiosity, or perhaps an instinct I couldn't articulate, I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. It simply read, "Thinking of you. Hope your meeting went well. Love, S." My heart did a strange little flutter. S? It wasn't Mom's initial. I rationalized it away immediately. A colleague, maybe, a client. But a tiny seed of unease had been planted. I tried to dismiss it, to bury it under layers of trust and familiar love. Our family was solid. Dad was solid. But the cracks, once started, continued to spread, almost imperceptibly beneath the surface of our perfect life. There was a growing chill in the house, a quiet tension that no one spoke of, but everyone felt. It was the feeling of holding your breath, waiting for something you couldn't name. The illusion finally shattered 2 years later, with the kind of brutal, mundane specificity that only real life can deliver. It wasn't a confession or an accident or a dramatic reveal. It was a funeral. Not for someone in our immediate family, but for my dad's oldest cousin, Thomas, who lived 3 states away. Thomas had been like an uncle to me, a kind, gruff man with a booming laugh, and his passing hit my father hard. Dad decided to drive alone, saying he needed the solitude to process the loss. Mom offered to go, but he insisted he'd be back within 2 days. That sounded odd, even for him, but we didn't push. It was a Friday. Monday morning, Mom called me, her voice tight with a fear I'd never heard. Dad hadn't come home. His phone went straight to voicemail. Panic clawed at my throat. We called hospitals, police departments, his work. Nothing. The police suggested we wait 24 hours. The waiting was agony, a slow drip of dread. My brother David and I drove to our parents' house, trying to comfort Mom, but we were all terrified. Late Monday night, around 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. My mom gasped. It was the police. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Mr. Henderson?" the officer asked. Mom nodded, tears already streaming. "We found your husband, ma'am. He was involved in a minor fender bender about 2 hours outside of town. He's fine, just a little shaken up. The other driver is also okay." A wave of immense relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. Mom sagged against the doorframe, crying silently. "Thank God," she whispered. Then the officer continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, a hesitant professionalism. "However, ma'am, there was a woman in the car with him, and a young girl. They identified themselves as his wife, Clara, and Lily, age 8. They showed us ID. Mr. Henderson also confirmed their relation." The world spun. My vision blurred. A phantom ringing filled my ears. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, a terrifying certainty that the world I knew was not just cracking, but splintering into a million irretrievable pieces. My father, my steadfast, honest father, had another family, another wife, another daughter. The silence in the hallway was deafening, broken only by Mom's slow, shuddering breath. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a gaping wound, ripped open by a mundane car accident, exposing the rot that had festered beneath our lives for decades. My entire sense of reality, of who I was, of who we were, was irrevocably shattered in that single brutal moment. The immediate aftermath was a blur of raw, unfiltered chaos. My mother collapsed onto the floor, not in tears, but in a profound, guttural moan that still echoes in my nightmares. David and I stood frozen, grappling with the incomprehensible words the officer had just uttered. It felt like a bomb had detonated in our living room, silent but utterly destructive. When Dad finally arrived home later that morning, driven by a concerned police officer, he walked into a war zone. His face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, and perhaps, finally, fear. He looked at Mom, crumpled on the floor, then at me and David, our faces masks of fury and disbelief. He didn't say a word. Mom found her voice then, a voice I barely recognized, sharp, brittle, filled with an unimaginable pain. "Who is she, Robert? Who is this Clara?" He just stood there, shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, treacherous road. The silence was deafening, filled only with Mom's ragged breathing and the pounding of my own heart. The confession, when it finally came, hours after frantic calls to his lawyer and a long, tearful conversation with us, was hollow. He admitted everything. Clara was his second wife, married for 9 years. Lily, his second daughter, was 8. He had met Clara on a business trip years ago, fallen in love, and somehow managed to compartmentalize his life with a terrifying precision.
He confessed to having a house, a life, a second family just 2 states away, sustained by his business trips and careful financial maneuvering. The details were a dull, relentless thud against my skull. Each admission felt like a fresh stab wound. My mother, Sarah, was utterly devastated. Her grief wasn't just sadness, it was a profound disorientation. The man she had loved and trusted for over 30 years was a stranger. Their marriage, the foundation of our lives, crumbled into dust. She retreated into herself, a ghost haunting her own home, barely eating, sleeping erratically, her vibrant spirit dimmed to a flicker. David reacted with explosive anger. He yelled, he cursed, he slammed doors. He felt a deep personal betrayal, not just for himself, but for Mom. He struggled with the idea of a sister he'd never known, an innocent child caught in our father's deceit. For me, the emotions were a confusing, agonizing cocktail of rage, sorrow, and utter disbelief. Every memory of my childhood, every loving gesture from Dad was now tainted, seen through the lens of his monstrous lie. Was it real? Was any of it real? I oscillated between wanting to scream at him, to hit him, and wanting to disappear into a hole where this reality didn't exist. My relationship with my father disintegrated overnight. The man I knew vanished, replaced by a stranger, a deceiver. I couldn't look at him without feeling a searing pain in my chest. Phone calls turned into arguments, visits became unbearable. We became estranged. The house that had been our haven became a battleground of raw emotions. Mom filed for divorce, a painful, drawn-out process that further exposed the depths of his financial deception, including a secret joint bank account he shared with Clara. The revelation of the second family became a quiet, devastating scandal in our close-knit community. Whispers, pitying glances, and the awkward avoidance of friends added another layer of isolation. We felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. For months, I walked around in a fog, struggling to focus at work, losing sleep. Therapy became a lifeline, a safe space to untangle the knotted mess of my emotions. The therapist helped me understand that my anger was valid, that my grief was legitimate, and that healing would be a long, non-linear journey. It was a period of profound reevaluation, not just of my father, but of trust itself, of the very nature of truth and the fragility of human connection. The world I knew had ended, and I was left to navigate its ruins, trying to find a way to rebuild, even as the pain lingered like a phantom limb.
The path to resolution wasn't a straight line, but a winding, often painful trek through a dense emotional forest. For years, the anger simmered, a constant companion. My relationship with Dad remained fractured, distant. We spoke only when absolutely necessary, and those conversations were strained, heavy with unspoken resentments. Mom, after the divorce, slowly, painstakingly started to rebuild her life. She found a new purpose in volunteering, reconnected with old friends, and eventually found a quiet strength I hadn't known she possessed. David, too, struggled, but eventually found a way to compartmentalize, choosing to focus on his own growing family rather than dwelling on the past. But for me, the question of forgiveness, or at least acceptance, became a persistent ache. The therapist often told me that forgiveness wasn't about condoning his actions, but about releasing myself from the prison of resentment. It sounded simple, but it felt impossible. The turning point, or at least a significant step, came several years after the revelation. My father suffered a minor heart attack. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was a stark reminder of his mortality and of the precious, finite nature of time.
Lying in the hospital bed, looking frail and vulnerable, he didn't seem like the imposing deceiver anymore. He seemed like an old, tired man. I visited him not out of duty, but out of a complicated mix of lingering love and a desperate need for answers, for closure. We spoke for hours, for the first time in years, not about the past betrayals, but about everything else, my life, his health, mundane things. And then, quietly, he spoke about his regrets. Not just the betrayal, but the decades of fear, the constant juggling, the deep loneliness of living a bifurcated life. He never offered excuses, only a profound, heartbreaking weariness. He talked about Clara and Lily, not as adversaries, but as another part of his broken world, and I saw, for the first time, not just the villain, but the deeply flawed, complex human being. It was during that conversation that something shifted within me. I realized that my anger, while justified, was also consuming me. It wasn't hurting him anymore, it was only hurting me. I didn't forgive him in that moment, not fully, but I began to understand that I could separate the man I loved from the actions I abhorred. I could acknowledge his brokenness without excusing his choices. The process of forgiveness became less about absolving him and more about finding peace for myself. It was about accepting that some wounds don't fully heal, but they can scar over, allowing new skin to grow. It meant learning to live with the paradox of loving someone who had caused immense pain. Today, my relationship with my father is tentative, fragile, but present. We don't talk about the past often, but we acknowledge its existence. We've built a new kind of connection, one based on realism, not the old, idealized illusion. I've never met Clara or Lily, and I don't know if I ever will. That part of the story remains separate, a boundary I need for my own peace. The life lesson I carry with me is profound and hard-won. Trust, once broken, is never fully restored to its original state, but new forms of connection can emerge from the rubble. True strength isn't just about resilience in the face of betrayal, but about the courage to dismantle your own preconceived notions, to see people as they are, flaws and all, and to find a way to carry your pain without letting it define you. It's about understanding that peace doesn't always mean the absence of pain, but the presence of acceptance. And sometimes the hardest forgiveness we offer is the one we extend to ourselves for not knowing what we couldn't have known, and for finding strength in the fragments of a shattered truth.